All right, let's read another edition of the Rambler. This is number 27 for Tuesday, June 19th, 1750. Do you want to come up here? Come here. Rudy wants to join me. I have to watch out, he'll bite me. This is by Dr. Samuel Johnson, number 27, and the title is An Author's Treatment from 6 Patrons. I think this might be a continuation of yesterday's. Let's see. So a bit of Latin here, I'll skip that, and then a quote. So he, who poverty with horror views, hold on. So he who poverty with horror views, who sells his freedom in exchange for gold, freedom from mines of wealth, too cheaply sold, shall make eternal servitude his fate, and feel the haughty master's galling weight. By Francis. Let's try this again. So he who poverty with horror views, so he's somebody who's rich and he views poverty, or who at least has money and who views poverty, who sells his freedom in exchange for gold. I see. Who's given up his freedom for the gold that he has, the money, the security. Freedom for mines of wealth, too cheaply sold. Freedom for, and it's in parentheses here. Freedom for mines of wealth, too cheaply sold. Freedom for mines of wealth, too cheaply sold. I don't know if I get that. Shall make eternal servitude his fate. So yeah, he's eternally a servant, and feel the haughty master's galling weight. So I guess it's an admonition of sorts for those who give up their freedom or exchange something in return for wealth and security. Here it begins. Mr. Rambler, as it is natural for every man to think himself of importance, your knowledge of the world will include you to forgive me if I imagine your curiosity so much excited by the former part of my narration as to make you desire that I should proceed without any unnecessary arts of connection. I shall therefore not keep you longer in such suspense, as perhaps my performance may not compensate. So this is indeed the continuation of yesterday's Rambler number 26, which was from at least it was written from the perspective of a young man who had been taken under his uncle's wing, gone to school. The uncle had paid for his education. And near the end, the young man had kind of been overtaken by his own sense of importance. Had made the mistake of, insulting his uncle, who then, in a very haughty way, the uncle then cut him loose to make his own way in the world, particularly in London, and it's not going so well. So he begins by saying that he's going to, he imagines himself so important that the Rambler Johnson would remember him, and he's going to get on with his story, but he recognizes that, he should probably have introduced himself, but he's going to proceed anyway. In the gay company with which I was now united, I found those allurements and delights which the friendship of young men always affords. There was that openness which naturally produced confidence, that affability which in some measure softened dependence, and that ardor of profession which incited hope. Good gosh, that's exactly how I remember college. Wow. In this case, it's after college. It's the young fraternity of men in London, right? So he's found a new group. They're wealthy, but they're a new group, and they accept him for what he is, even though he has to kind of pay the price for his meals and his drinks because he doesn't have any money. With what would he be? He's become a bit of a sycophant to all the other men. Let me read that part again. This is good. It's all good. In the gay company with which I was now united, I found those allurements and delights which the friendship of young men always affords. There was that openness which naturally produced confidence, that affability which in some measure softened dependence, and that ardor of profession which incited hope. I'm going to underline that part. The friendship of young men always affords. Yeah. When our hearts were dilated with merriment, promises were poured out with unlimited profusion, and life and fortune were but a scanty sacrifice to friendship. Wow. But when the hour came at which any effort was to be made, I had generally the vexation to find that my interest weighed nothing against the slightest amusement, and that every petty avocation was found a sufficient plea for continuing me in uncertainty and want. Their kindness was indeed sincere when they promised they had no intention to deceive, but the same juvenile warmth which kindled their benevolence came forth, but the same juvenile warmth which kindled their benevolence gave force in the same proportion to every other passion, and I was forgotten as soon as any new pleasures seized on their attention. So the young man would, because he's looking for a place, a position, a job of some sort, and he's hoping that these men of connection and wealth might be able to help him, if not provide a job for them, him themselves, introduce him to somebody who might. Remember, this is 17th century. 18th century. This is 18th century London. Not a good place to be without a job, or prospects, or support. So he's talking about one of his friends here, Vagario. Vagario told me one evening that all my perplexities should be soon at an end, and desired me from that instant to throw upon him all care of my fortune, for a post of considerable value was that day become vacant, and he knew his interest sufficient to procure it in the morning. He desired me to call on him early, that he might be dressed soon enough to wait on the minister before any other application should be made. I came as he appointed, with all the flame of gratitude, and was told by his servant that having found at his lodgings when he came home an acquaintance who was going to travel, he had been persuaded to accompany him to Dover, and that they had taken post horses 2 hours before day. So he had that opportunity, but then, just like he said, the next glint, shiny object, off they go. I was once very near to preferment by the kindness of Charinas, who, at my request, went to beg a place, which he thought me likely to fill with great reputation, and in which I should have many opportunities of promoting his interest in return. And he pleased himself with imagining the mutual benefit that we should confer, and the advances that we should make by our united strength. Away therefore he went, equally warm with friendship and ambition, and left me to prepare acknowledgments against his return. At length he came back and told me that he had met in his way a party going to breakfast in the country, and the ladies importuned him too much to be refused, and that having passed the morning with them, he was come back to dress himself for a ball, to which he was invited for the evening. Such a life. Breakfast with the ladies in the countryside, and then a ball in the evening. Never mind the friend's position. I love that word, importune. I have suffered several disappointments from tailors and periwig makers, who, by neglecting to perform their work, withheld my patrons from court, and once failed of an establishment for life by the delay of a servant, sent in a neighboring shop to replenish a snuff box. What? One more time. I didn't quite catch this. I have suffered several disappointments from tailors and periwig makers who, by neglecting to perform their work, withheld. Oh, I see. So I didn't. It's not like the tailors or the wig makers were going to provide them a job, but they were the people that would have helped them were delayed by the wig makers and the tailors. I get it. I have suffered several disappointments from tailors and periwig makers who, by neglect. One more time. I have suffered several disappointments from tailors and periwig makers who, by neglecting to perform their work, withheld my patrons from court, and once failed of an establishment for life by the delay of a servant sent to a neighboring shop to replenish a snuff box. At last I thought my solicitude at an end, for an office fell into the gift of Hippodamus's father, who, being then in the country, could not very speedily fill it, and whose fondness would not have suffered him to refuse his son a less reasonable request. Hippodamus, therefore, set forward with great expedition, and I expected every hour an account of his success. A long time I waited without any intelligence, but at last received a letter from Newmarket, by which I was informed that the races were begun, and I knew the vehemence of his passions too well to imagine that he could refuse himself his favorite amusement. So again, loses his chance. You will not wonder that I was at last weary of the patronage of young men, especially as I found them not generally to promise much greater fidelity as they advanced in life, for I observed that what they gained in steadiness they lost in benevolence, and grew colder. I'm going to underline that. That what they gained in steadiness they lost in benevolence. What an interesting trade-off as one gets older. And it grew colder to my interest as they became more diligent to promote their own. I was convinced that their liberality was only profuseness, that as chance directed they were equally generous to vice and virtue, that they were warm but because they were thoughtless, and counted the support of a friend only amongst other gratifications of passion. These opportunities are fading, huh? My resolution was now to ingratiate myself with men whose reputation was established, whose high stations enabled them to prefer me, and whose age exempted them from sudden changes of inclination. I was considered as a man of parts, and therefore easily found admission to the table of Hilarius, the celebrated orator, renowned equally for the extent of his knowledge, the elegance of his diction, and the acuteness of his wit. Hilarius received me with an appearance of great satisfaction, produced to me all his friends, and directed to me that part of his discourse in which he most endeavored to display his imagination. I had now learned my own interest enough to supply him opportunities for smart remarks and gay sallies, which I never failed to echo and applaud. Thus I was gaining every hour of his affection, till, unfortunately, when the assembly was more splendid than usual, his desire of admiration prompted him to turn his raillery upon me. I bore it for some time with great submission. Hold on, I missed this part. Thus I was gaining every hour, so he's gaining the favor of this man, this Hilarius. Now I understand. I didn't quite get it before. I kind of knew all along that this is fiction made up by Johnson. This is not a real letter. Now I should have picked it up sooner, but nonetheless, fascinating. Thus I was gaining every hour on his affections, till unfortunately, when the assembly was more splendid than usual, his desire of admiration prompted him to turn his raillery upon me. So he becomes the victim. I bore it for some time with great submission, and success encouraged him to redouble his attacks. At last my vanity prevailed over my prudence. I retorted his irony with such spirit that Hilarius, unaccustomed to resistance, was disconcerted, and soon found means of convincing me that his purpose was not to encourage a rival, but to foster a parasite. Wow. I was then taken into the familiarity of Argiotio, a nobleman eminent for judgment and criticism. I'm sure that Johnson was very proud of these Latin Roman sounding names that he came up for his characters. Argiotio. I was then taken into the familiarity of Argiotio, a nobleman eminent for judgment and criticism. He had contributed to my reputation by the praises which he had often bestowed upon my writings, in which he owned that there were proofs of a genius that might rise to high degrees of excellence when time and information had reduced its exuberance. He therefore required me to consult him before the publication of any new performance, and commonly proposed innumerable alterations without sufficient attention to the general design, or regard to my form of style and mode of imagination. But these corrections he never failed to press as indispensably necessary, and thought the least delay of compliance an act of rebellion. The pride of an author made this treatment insufferable, and I thought any tyranny easier to be borne than that which took from me the use of my understanding. Hold on, I didn't quite get this one. So he's got this nobleman, Argiotio, and he contributed to my reputation by the praises which he had often bestowed on my writing. So he's praising him for his work, and he says that he's going to rise. His writings will help him rise in the world. He therefore required me to consult him before the publication of any new performance. So he wants to be consulted before he does anything new. And he was like an editor. He's commonly proposing innumerable alterations without sufficient attention to the general design, so without seeing the big picture, in regard to my form of style and mode of imagination. But these corrections he never failed to press as indispensably necessary, and thought the least delay of compliance an act of rebellion. Okay. The pride of an author made this treatment insufferable, so he couldn't take it. So he pushed back and lost another friend, another potential supporter. So interesting how he could be giving up his character with that first man. So he's left the young man. He's now found an older patrons, and he would have to given up his character. He would have to become a parasite, basically, to continue the support of that one man, Hilarius. And now he would have to give up his style, his character, to be supported by Argiotio, and he refuses both, and he winds up without. Next paragraph, next patron, I think. My next patron was Eutyches. I can't pronounce this. Eutyches. Eutyches. And I don't know what this is, because the other ones I can kind of guess. Hilarius, Argumentus, Argiotio. I think I get those, but not this one. Humor and argument. I don't know what this one is. My next patron was Eutyches, the statesman, who was wholly engaged in public affairs, and seemed to have no ambition but to be powerful and rich. I found his favor more permanent than that of the others, for there was a certain price at which it might be bought. I found his favor more permanent than that of the others, for there was a certain price at which it might be bought. He allowed nothing to humor or to affection, but was always ready to pay liberally for the service that he required. His demands were indeed very often such as virtue could not easily consent to gratify. But virtue is not to be consulted when men are to rise their fortunes, by the favor of the great. Ah, that's worth quoting right there. So now he's got one who he will have to compromise his virtue. You know, that's the last straw, right? To pursue. Okay, I'm going to underline this. Virtue is not to be consulted when men are to raise their fortunes by the favor of the great. Wow, great quote there, Dr. Johnson. Love it. His measures were censure. I wrote in his defense and was recompensed with a place, of which the profits were never received by me, without the pangs of remembering that, and I was recompensated with a place of which the profits were never received by me, without the pangs of remembering that they were the reward of wickedness, a reward which nothing but the necessity which the consumption of my little estate in these wild pursuits had brought upon me, hindered me from throwing back in the face of my corrupter. One more time. I wrote in his defense, so he's writing for this man, this politician, Eustachius. I wrote in his defense and was recompensed with a place of which the profits were never received by me, without the pangs of remembering that they were the reward of wickedness, a reward which nothing but that necessity which the consumption of my little estate in these wild pursuits had brought upon me, hindered me from throwing back in the face of my corruptors. Why? A reward which nothing but the necessity which the consumption of my little estate in these wild pursuits had brought upon me, hindered me from. So he's finding himself hard to give it up, even though it's a place, it's a position, it's a job. It's compensating him, but every time he realizes that he's selling himself, but his situation is so desperate that he can't say no. Now it comes back to that quote at the beginning, right? Now it makes sense. At this time, my uncle died without a will, and I became heir to a small fortune. I had resolution to throw off the splendor which reproached me to myself and retire to a humbler state, in which I am now endeavoring to recover the dignity of virtue, and hope to make some reparation, for my crime and follies, by informing others, who may be led after the same pageants, that they are about to engage in a course of life in which they are to purchase by 1,000 miseries the privilege of repentance. That's the end. To purchase by 1,000 miseries the privilege of repentance. That's another one worth quoting. Very nice. And in this case, he signs it Ubulus, which I'm sure if I knew Latin, that would mean something to me. Very, very well done. So it can finish this one in two sections. The previous Rambler and this one, and we bring that story full closure. I really liked it. Very, very well done. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Look at how the page doesn't quite line up. This 200-year-old book's halfway through this one. What a great cautionary tale. Thanks for joining me.